It is the 80th birthday of the UN, and to mark the occasion, Donald Trump made some quite spicy remarks to the UN earlier this week. Here are some of the things he had to say.
That whoever's operating this teleprompter is in big trouble. I ended 7 wars, dealt with the leaders of each and every one of these countries, and never even received a phone call from the United Nations offering to help in finalizing the deal. All I got from the United Nations was an escalator that on the way up stopped right in the middle. If the First Lady wasn't in great shape, she would have fallen, but she's in great shape. We're both in good shape. We both stood. And then a teleprompter that didn't work. These are the 2 things I got from the United Nations, a bad escalator and a bad teleprompter. Not only is the UN not solving the problems it should, too often, it's actually creating new problems for us to solve. The best example is the #1 political issue of our time, the crisis of uncontrolled migration. It's uncontrolled. Your countries are being ruined. The United Nations is funding an assault on Western countries and their borders. In 2024, the UN budgeted $372 million in cash assistance to support an estimated 624,000 migrants journeying into the United States. Think of that. The UN is supporting people that are illegally coming into the United States, and then we have to get them out.
Edmund Fitton-Brown, thank you for joining us on Spectator TV. What was your reaction to his remarks?
I was expecting that he would be critical of the UN. It's no surprise that the Americans would be. We would have to acknowledge that there were some things that didn't go as planned. There was obviously some disruption over his arrival, some disruption over the teleprompter. So I didn't find any of it that surprising. I suppose I was slightly surprised that he overran his time limit by quite so much.
Yes, it was. His limit was supposed to be 15 minutes and it was over an hour. Is that correct?
I think it was maybe just under an hour, but I'm not sure.
Quite incredible, really. And Trump's been critical of the UN for a very long time. You worked for the UN from 2017 to 2022. Has your view of the institution changed over the years?
I'm only doing 2 live UK events in the entire country for the launch of my new book, Woke is Dead. Just 2. And Scotland, you lucky devils, are getting one of them. On October the 20th, I'm joining the Spectator and Andrew Doyle at Glasgow's Pavilion Theatre for a no-holds-barred evening of debate on why I believe woke culture is finished and how we can bring back some good old-fashioned common sense. Expect a lively and entertaining evening of unfiltered, uncensored conversation. So Glasgow, are you ready for some home truths? Book the tickets now. I'll see you there.
It has, and it's changed not just in the period since 2017, but longer than that, because, of course, as a British diplomat before that, I had a lot of involvement with the UN, especially when I was ambassador to Yemen. The UN was a very important part of the potential peacemaking process in Yemen. Of course, that didn't succeed. So in that period, what I have noticed is a sort of encroaching dysfunction. I think the UN has always had an element of dysfunction, a large element actually of dysfunction, but it's a very large organization. And it also contained many centers of excellence and very high performance. Unfortunately, I would say that particularly over the last decade, when I've been monitoring it or involved with it very closely, I would say that sort of encroaching dysfunction has accelerated, and also that the British and American engagement with the United Nations has become less effective. Now, that in the UK's case, that may well have been to do with Brexit and the fact that Brexit consumed a lot of the bandwidth of the UK civil service. And there was a kind of a tax on other British official activities, including engagement with the United Nations. In the case of the United States, of course, that skepticism that Donald Trump has always felt about the UN and also about the US State Department I would say that had an effect from the beginning of his first administration, when he was, not keen to work much through state, and state was weakened, and state's contribution to the UN was also weakened. Now, in that period, of course, others have been paying attention to the UN, and that includes the Russians and the Chinese and a whole range of other countries. And for that reason, there's been a sense of encroaching influence from the various autocracies who have been using the leverage of the United Nations to its full value, whereas I think the West has weakened in its use of the United Nations.
And do they use it to its full value? Do you have any examples where Russia has gained a small win or China has gained a small win from the UN?
It is, of course, more a general sense of just how lavishly they resource their engagement. So that large mission, present in all committees, present in all deliberations of the United Nations, significant sections of the mission dedicated to dealing with key issues like allocation of budget and those sorts of things. These are things where I would say the Russians have always been strong, but they've remained very strong. And places where I saw that up close would include, oddly enough, a subject that was to some degree in the air in New York this week, which was the new Syria. When I was at the United Nations, I was responsible for sanctions on ISIS, Al-Qaeda, and the Taliban. And that meant that I saw some of the deliberations that went on over the sanctioning of Ahmed al-Shara's group in Syria, and then of the new name of that group, because you may remember they used to be known as al-Nusra Front, then they became a sort of a coalition that was called Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, HTS. And I was very struck at that time that when the Russians were moving to strengthen the sanctions against HTS, because of course at that time the Russians were absolutely backing Assad to the hilt, and so as far as they were concerned, any Syrian oppositionists were the enemy. And I was just very struck at that time that it was the Russians taking the lead on that. And it was the P3, as we call them, the US, the UK, and France, the permanent members who were aligned with each other on the Western agenda, who were entirely reactive on that. And whilst the Americans had their views and did sort of speak up for their views, I found that the British and French positions really were just a sort of a pale reflection of the American view. And ultimately, when the Americans accepted what the Russians wanted to do, Britain and France fell into line pretty much automatically. So that's a good example. That's where the sort of attention to detail that's required in every single committee, on every single motion that is attempted, is not there so much these days with either Britain or America. And that does shift the advantage.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you more about Syria then, because if you look at what's happened this week, Syria's trying to create a new name for itself in the world. Do you think, if you could imagine this imaginary world where the UN didn't exist, could Syria have made the advancements it has with America, with its own negotiations, without a body like the UN? Could it just approach different countries individually?
Well, it could, and it has. It's obviously this week we're all very focused on New York, but a lot has been happening in the background. And sad to say, I don't think that the United Nations has been hugely relevant in Syria over the last year or two, perhaps even longer than that. What happened, as you know, was that there was a very significant shift in the balance of power in Syria's immediate environment, and in particular, it was Israel's defeat of Lebanese Hezbollah that had this effect. But there were other things that played into this: the weakness of Iran, the weakness of Russia, and all of a sudden, Ahmed al-Shara's HTS was able to sweep into control of Syria. So that happened without the UN being in any way relevant. And then what's happened since then, of course, has been that the UN hasn't really been able to do much to alter its approach to Syria because you need unanimity on the Security Council to introduce new resolutions, or at least you need nobody to veto a new resolution in the UN. And so issues like sanctions relief have moved very slowly in New York, whereas they've moved very quickly where they've been being dealt with unilaterally, as in the case of the United States, where the US has been able to make some changes. So I would say, the UN is not irrelevant by any means. And from Shara's point of view, it was obviously a huge gain to be able to be in New York and just to present as the leader of Syria in front of a global audience. And of course, the other really important thing that New York still provides is this venue for masses of bilateral and multilateral diplomatic engagement, which otherwise wouldn't happen, or if it did happen, it would have to happen on carefully scheduled and very expensive bilateral or multilateral visits, people flying to each other's capitals and that sort of thing. So, I think there's been a big sort of leap forward for Shara's profile because of this week in New York. So I don't want to say that the UN is not relevant, but if the UN didn't exist and if the general debate had not been happening, I think we would still have seen Shara sort of edging forward through his engagements with countries like Turkey, Saudi Arabia, the United States, and others.
Why do you think Trump, who was so quick to criticize the UN, still felt motivated to attend and give a speech? Why not just not bother, vote with your feet, boycott the place, don't show up? Why not do that?
I mean, there are Americans who suggest that kind of approach. I meet Americans who say we should just quit, we should just leave, we should boycott it, we should expel it from New York. That sort of very negative view of the UN is fairly widespread in the US. I think President Trump has a much better understanding of the fact that it does have residual value to the United States in a number of ways. Remember, he was a New York real estate dealer. He understands the enormous value of the UN to the New York economy. So there's that. If you threw the United Nations out of New York, you'd leave a gaping hole in the economy of Manhattan. But more, sorry, I'm being slightly frivolous there because that's a sort of a sideshow. But from his point of view, it's a global forum, and it is a global forum. It is the global forum. There isn't anything else, if you think about it, that remotely matches up to the general debate in terms of having a captive global audience, both physically on the ground in New York and also in terms of the media coverage, which is blanket, universal, global, while the general debate is going on. So he understands the value of that kind of podium. And then I think the other important point is that the United States is overwhelmingly the largest funder of the United Nations. Now, the United States is delinquent in terms of not paying its dues to the UN on time. And that is an issue that we need to watch because, of course, it's possible that we'll actually see a significant reduction in US funding to the UN permanently, and that would cause the organization real pain because the budget is very precarious. But for as long as the US is the major funder of the United Nations, why would the American president not use it for as much value as it can offer?
I want to ask you about the internal politics of working at the UN. It's something that lots of people don't really get to have a look into. I actually used to work at the European Parliament, so I got a sense of all these countries coming together. But the difference, I suppose, with the European Parliament is it was very political. You were going for drinks with people on the right side of Germany and then on the left side of Italy. So people were always talking about politics and their political views and how the world should be shaped, but also what Britain should be doing. They're never short of opinions about Brexit and British politics. Is it the same somewhere like the UN, or is it a bit more civil service-y where people there should be very careful about what they say in politics? And then how do the people that work at the UN then translate into decisions that are made?
Yeah, I would say it's more civil servicey, but with obviously the sort of the extreme complication of the international dimension, the fact that you've got every nationality under the sun is represented there. And that makes for an interesting dynamic because, you'll have let's say you have a sort of some department of the UN where you have a Singaporean who's line managing a Brazilian who in turn is line managing an American who in turn is line managing a Russian, etc. You can imagine what that sort of feels like, and of course that then does, to be fair to the UN, that does come down to a large degree to, first of all, professional discipline, that you don't bring your nationality to work. And that's not universal. It's not always respected, but I would say it's respected to a remarkably high degree. And then you've got the sort of the focus on the mission. So whatever it is you're dealing with, in my case, it was sanctions on terrorist groups or sanctions on members of the Taliban. And you would find that actually you could work happily with your colleagues, whether they were from a country that had a fairly different perspective or not, and that there was a clear understanding that you had to do what the UN was telling you to do. Now, as I said, that wasn't universally respected. Of course, national agendas are always playing out through the UN, not just through the missions in New York, which is where they should play out, but also through improper influence over UN staff and UN experts from their capitals. But actually, even now, I would say the extent of that is surprisingly manageable.
The UN has come under a lot of criticism since the Israel-Gaza war, particularly since October the 7th. And it recently recognized the situation in Gaza as genocidal. I found it really interesting to read in your piece, Edmund, that you don't really think that the General Secretary, Antonio Guterres, is up to the job. He's a former socialist PM of Portugal. How much does his politics trickle down into the UN? And also, how do they navigate these massive international issues like Israel-Gaza? Was it wrong for them to deem it as genocide?
Well, first of all, it's important to say that that finding on genocide was by a commission that was appointed by the UN Human Rights Agency, and so that was something that Guterres was able to say, well, that's not my, I'm not saying that. That's just something that some independent experts appointed by the Human Rights Agency have said. But still, I feel that this is one of the areas in which the UN has gone horribly wrong. And this has been happening for a long time, of course. If you trace back the history of United Nations General Assembly resolutions against Israel, and then compare them to resolutions against anybody else, or indeed against everybody else, you find that the sort of hostile attention on Israel is and has always been outrageously disproportionate. Whatever you think of Israel, whether you're inclined to defend it or inclined to criticize it, there is no world in which Israel is more reprehensible than the rest of the world combined, or more reprehensible than, let's say North Korea, Iran, Syria, etc., Russia, etc., combined. So the General Assembly has consistently over the decades made itself ridiculous in this way. And the reason for that, of course, is that everyone's represented in the General Assembly, and General Assembly resolutions don't have legal force. And so they become essentially a talking shop, an arena for venting frustration. And the lowest common denominator prevails. And of course, again, the numbers tell. So, how many Jewish states are there in the world? There's one. How many Muslim states are there in the world? Well, there are a lot. How many sort of old-fashioned sort of socialist states that sort of hang on to the sort of pieties of the 60s and 70s, there are also a lot. Whereas how many Western countries are there that are willing to consistently adopt unpopular positions in the General Assembly? Only a few, with Britain having been an honourable exception to that, having generally speaking voted the right way historically in the General Assembly, and the United States having, I think, almost invariably been willing to take the brickbats and just go ahead and sort of say no, we're going to oppose this resolution. But there's no veto in the General Assembly, so these absurd and repetitive resolutions against Israel just pass again and again and again by something like 100 in favour to 50 abstentions to 30 against, or something of that kind. And often, particularly when it's a very emotive time as it is at the moment, often that majority then becomes much, much sharper against Israel, and you end up with a really small number of people opposing. So there's that aspect of it. Then you have the problem of UN agencies, which have a built-in opposition to Israel. And of course, the worst of these is the Palestinian Refugee Agency, UNRWA, which is UNRWA, and which, as you know, has been a focus of American discontent for quite some time now. But when the UN conducted an inquiry about the participation of members of UNRWA in the Hamas attack on Israel 2 years ago, the inquiry was hopelessly weak and anemic, and I think they ended up firing a handful of people. Whereas actually the problem in UNRWA is endemic. It's an endemic hostility to Israel, and that reflects through to UNRWA's work, which includes managing an educational curriculum in the schools that it is that it's responsible for, which is teaching hatred of Israel and hatred of Jews. So the Americans have lost patience with this. They're furious about it, and they're furious that the UN isn't taking it seriously. And they're also furious that when they got involved with the Israelis in trying to set up the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, that the UN refused to engage with that and said that was politicizing aid. So the UN is almost willfully deaf on that sort of thing. Same thing with the reappointment earlier this year of Francesca Albanese, who is somebody that not just the US, but a lot of the West had lost confidence in. But the Human Rights Commission insisted on reappointing her as special representative. So this is the problem, that the UN has been especially weak on Israel, and since the 7th of October attack, this has accelerated and got worse. You may remember that Antonio Guterres committed one of the worst blunders of his time when immediately after that attack, instead of expressing overwhelming sorrow and sympathy and condemnation, which is the only possible reaction to a terrorist attack on that scale and of that brutality, he said, well, this didn't come out of nowhere, though, did it? Which was, a staggering. And of course, a large number of the people that I know in the United Nations just completely gave up on him at that point. And the last thing I'll say, just to answer your question, or part of your original question, is about Guterres himself. And here, we are partly to blame, the UK, the US, all of the Permanent Five, actually, Russia, China, France as well. I think that the Permanent Five have always wanted to avoid an overmighty Secretary General, because if you had somebody as Secretary General who was really dynamic and effective and charismatic, I'm trying to think of a good example, but let's say a sort of a Václav Havel figure, or a Mikhail Gorbachev figure, or a Bill Clinton figure, or something like that, then it would provide a real alternative focus of power in the UN. And so I think there has been a little bit of a conspiracy to appoint relatively weak or compliant secretaries general. And, Guterres was appointed, a Portuguese former socialist. And I think the sense was that, well, what harm can it do? Because he's not very powerful anyway. The problem with that is you then get somebody who's frustrated and wants to make a lot of noise. but they do it in a way that is not particularly effective or constructive.
We saw that Violet Affleck, Ben Affleck's daughter of two very famous actors, attended the UN and made a speech wearing a face mask because she's unhappy that people don't wear face masks anymore. She still believes that COVID is very much a risk and that there should be a ban on banning face masks.
And imagine, and who will not know the potential of their own minds unfettered by the cognitive damage from a COVID-19 infection. And I am furious on their behalf. It is neglect of the highest order to look children in the eyes and say, we knew how to protect you, and we didn't do it. We have access to a technology to prevent airborne disease, something that millions of our ancestors and millions of people around the world today would kill for, and we refuse to use it. And I shudder to think of where we will be in another 5 years of unmitigated infection and reinfection.
I just wanted to get your opinion on in what world having, sort of such a Nepo baby situation could be a good look for the UN, and who makes these decisions to have someone like Ben Affleck's daughter making this point when the crisis in Sudan, perhaps, in Yemen, you could speak to that, is overlooked.
Yeah, gosh, that's a good point. I suppose this is one of those things where the UN has star quality, partly because of what I was saying earlier about this sort of global forum, and it's the only sort of the general debate is the only event of its kind in the world, and because of New York as well. New York, is dripping with star quality, isn't it? So the UN sometimes, I think, drifts rather close to celebrity worship. Now, sometimes that's done judiciously, and you get the involvement of a person of substance like Amal Clooney, who whatever you think of her perspective on things, she's a serious person, and she's eloquent, and so you get the combination of substance and star quality, which the UN finds very appealing, and it can be very effective in terms of either raising awareness or raising funds or things of that kind. So the question is, do they always get this right? Do they drift too far and sort of you end up with somebody of very limited merit who is chosen purely because they sort of Hollywood royalty or something of that kind? And I guess that probably is a fair criticism. I can understand it. If you're a sort of a slightly colourless international bureaucrat and you get to rub shoulders with sort of glitterati, then there's a certain attraction to that, and you can probably justify it, as I said, in terms of raising awareness or raising funds. On the face mask thing, this is a really interesting one, isn't it? Because the face masks are associated with a number of things. On the one hand, they've been associated with veiling in traditional societies with some implications for women's rights outside the home. Can you be required to cover your hair, required to cover your face, or whatever? There's that sort of older dimension to it. We have the more recent dimension of COVID, which obviously that was where she was speaking from, and of course that's a live disagreement in the United States about whether the regulations around COVID were overly restrictive or overly prescriptive. Prescriptive is the word I'm looking for, isn't it? And that's a sort of a current sort of polarizing left-right disagreement in the US, where she's obviously coming from the left side of that particular debate. But I think it would be unfortunate, wouldn't it, if people whose health was in any way compromised, regardless of COVID, whether they felt that they needed to use a medical mask to reduce some kind of exposure to germs. It'd be a shame if they felt that they couldn't do that without being abused or attacked. And then most recently, of course, we've had this really encroaching problem of masking at demonstrations, which has happened in the UK and in North America, and has been really, I would say, has verged on intimidation of anyone who disagrees with those administrations. You've had people, whether they've got keffiyehs across their face or whatever it is that they're using to cover up, are using it for anonymity and in order to threaten people or intimidate them without any possibility of being identified and suffering any kind of legal consequences. And that also is a somewhat polarizing debate in terms of the US as to whether you're pro-campus protests or against campus protests, and that's usually a lot to do with whether you're anti-Israel or pro-Israel. So all of these things, I think, are playing in together in the masking debate, and I think they all need to be looked at in a very serious way. I've come around to the view that unless you have a medical reason, you should not be allowed to cover your face in public, because I just think that the security implications and the implications in terms of intimidation are too serious.
It seems to me it's just a poor girl who grew up in the paparazzi era and just doesn't really want her photo to be taken every 5 seconds. So you've got to feel sorry for her, but doesn't necessarily need a speech at the UN. Edmund Fitton-Brown, thank you so much for joining us on Spectator TV. It was great to have you.